Hello. This presentation is to clarify some questions and provide additional guidance around the implementation of mental health services, specifically for individuals with Medicaid here at the Stress and Trauma Treatment Center. As we move forward, one important aspect is to know that we are transitioning all services to those that are provided through managed care organizations for Medicaid services and Medicaid reimbursement. This is our sustainability plan. And at this particular point, we want all clients, no exceptions, all clients to go and the next services that are provided, whether it's tomorrow or next week, the next time that you meet with someone, that we are using Medicaid reimbursement services. There are a couple of exceptions, but many of those clients then will start the IATP process using the IM+CANS, the Integrated Assessment and Treatment Plan process. There are some exceptions, though. There are a few services that HFS and Medicaid will allow you to do without a finalized IATP. Of course, one of those things is the IATP. So just know that an integrated assessment and treatment plan, that you don't have to get that done all in one setting. You may find yourself that it may take multiple meetings or multiple hours, so that you may end up meeting with someone for 2 hours, or you might end up reviewing a lot of the records for a portion of that, reviewing records and documentation outside of having a meeting specifically with the client that allows you to complete a lot of the form, and then having the meeting with the client and family so that you can end up spending this time to get to this shared understanding of the needs, strengths, and directions for treatment. Now, the IATP is one. Another service is mental health case management. Mental health case management can be provided up to 30 days prior to the IATP signature. IATPs are not considered finished or finalized until the LPHA has signed that document. So if it takes me 2 weeks to be able to get the document and the assessment complete and signed by the family members and myself, then when I send it on, it may take even an additional week before the LPHA is able to sign that document. So keep that in mind. That it may not be as early as you might think for mental health case management services. Also, we can do IATP psychological assessment. This is typically what we refer to as a psychological evaluation. Those activities can happen without having a finalized IATP, and that they can inform the IATP process. And then lastly, crisis management services. Crisis management services, if deemed necessary, medically necessary, can be provided prior to the completion of the IM+CANS or IATP process. We'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like as I go through this presentation. As a reminder, and I know a lot of people have heard this, that no clients will be considered primarily funded by grants, with the exception of redeploy services. So all other grants are not the primary funder. Instead, we're using a funding priority that is provided to us by the federal government, that we first have to use private and personal funds, that an individual is responsible for their services first, and then their private insurance is responsible for their services or the cost of services. And then lastly, taxpayers or public dollars are responsible for services. Depending on kind of a definition of where Medicaid and grants are, both being publicly funded, we're using a prioritization for Medicaid first, and then grants second. So as stated before, please make sure that your next activity that you have with clients, that you are using one of the above service codes. Probably will be an IATP service code for the initial integrated assessment and treatment plan, but make sure that your next activities are starting these billable Medicaid services. So let me talk a little bit more and dig in a little more about a couple of these service types that are eligible prior to the LPHA signatures on the IM+CANS. First is mental health case management. Mental health case management is activity that can be provided with the client present or without the client present. Sometimes we refer to this as doing things for our clients. This can include assessment, planning, coordination, and advocacy for services that a consumer, a client may end up needing, and they may require assistance for gaining access or utilizing any of these supports that are out in the community. Supports such as physical health services and primary care services, social types of supports that are out there, vocational, job training, educational opportunities, housing, public income, all types of things that we may spend time assessing the need for, planning for what that can look like, coordinating the activities for a consumer, or advocating that a consumer can have access or will get a fair opportunity to utilize different types of supports, all types of supports within our community. This may also include identifying and investigating available resources, explaining options to the customer, and linking the customer with those necessary resources. So I might go online and investigate what type of after-school programs are available, or what kind of summer camps are available for my client. And in doing so, those are activities that are mental health case management. And then as I identify, maybe it's 4 different camps, and maybe they're from all over the place, different options with different strengths and weaknesses. I might give options to my clients or their family. And then once they choose 1 or 2, then I might try to link them, help them with the application process or do the application process for them, learn what all the process for enrollment might be, what are the criteria, and be able to help navigate that for families that may be overwhelmed or overstressed, that don't have the ability to do these things for themselves. When we're doing case management, mental health case management prior to an IATP, our note has to have a brief justification of why these activities are medically necessary, that these activities have to happen prior to the IATP, that they are necessary to happen now. And then we also need to talk about how we're referring them back to either a treatment provider that they have, or how we're going to be doing the IATP in the near future. And so sometimes we're doing mental health case management even to help people get access to the IATP meeting, right? So I might be talking with them about transportation options, childcare options, some of the barriers on that may be in the way of participating in that original intake. Those could be mental health case management activities and services, but I want to be linking them to either the IATP or some other services. Now, once I have an IATP and case management mental health is included as a service type, the IATP is now the document that clarifies the necessity, the medical necessity for that service. As mentioned before, we also could do psychological assessment, or what we refer to as psychological evaluation a lot. Within this, there are some terminology that is important. And as we're looking at some of this, this is language specifically out of the provider handbook. What I encourage is that use this language in your service notes, your progress notes. Actually use the exact language out of these definitions. And if you can't, consider, am I doing that service? Is that the right service? Or maybe it's something else that I might be doing that might, if my activity might meet a different definition better than the one that I'm looking at here. And so we might spend time, the activities spend time performing or reviewing or interpreting diagnostic assessments or tests that have been administered. The purpose of this activity, we have to clarify that it's about identifying needs or confirming or reviewing or differentiating diagnosis, and what services might best be recommended based on the information that's collected in the psychological assessment or evaluation. It does require that we're using standardized psychological assessment instruments. That doesn't mean that every single one of them has to be that, but that's part of the battery that are being administered. As a reminder for this and many others, that report writing is not, and documentation of progress notes and things like that are not reimbursable activities, or not billable activities, should not have service notes for those activities. However, if I'm doing interpretation, if I'm scoring, if I'm doing the activities that it requires for me to interpret the test and the results, those are reimbursable activities. We want to make sure that we also are reviewing this with families. We're giving information, giving a copy of this to families as well, and or to other professionals. Maybe I'm doing a psychological assessment or evaluation, and there's a therapist or a counselor or a psychiatric provider. As I'm providing information back to them, that also can be considered IATP, psychological assessment, if it's around the appropriate service planning for that client or that family. Crisis intervention, as I mentioned before, that's a service that can be implemented prior to the IATP, or even after the IATP has been finalized. And so in that, we're looking at short-term delivery of interventions that help support an immediate intervention or need for intervention based on some type of crisis. And either that could be crisis symptoms that just start to pop up and are significant, and the need for stabilization. This can be crisis intervention, de-escalation, or response techniques, how to respond to those things, whether it's a caregiver or spouse, sibling, etc., educator, etc., how to respond in those situations. That all can be considered crisis intervention. One thing to note is that if there's not an IATP and you've not been providing services to this person prior, then you cannot start with phone or video service for crisis intervention. It does have to be in person. Once you've established services with them, if you document it in the IATP, and in your IATP, you can see that as an other service, that you can add that other service and just explicitly describe that you are doing crisis intervention. In many cases, we can pretty much predict that crisis intervention will be part of the service array. If you list it there, then you can say that you're going to do phone or video services. Now, with crisis intervention, you do have to justify why it is medically necessary if you don't have it in your IATP. If you have it in your IATP, you don't have to justify it as much, because the IATP actually justifies that. And it's part of, and again, if I'm doing my assessment, my intake, and I'm identifying that there's suicidality or there's certain type of risk for homicidality or something else, then those crisis intervention services, I should build that right into my treatment plan, because I'm anticipating that is going to be the case, and that's going to be a necessary service throughout the episode of care. So part of this is we want to be able to, for necessity, we have to identify that a customer's decompensated, their functioning has been impaired significantly and typically in a rapid manner, and they're not able to deal or cope with the immediate stressors, and that they need this immediate delivery of services. If it's not a need for immediate, then we still do the IATP, right? We don't want the crisis of the week to end up driving this, because what can happen is the next week there's another crisis of the week, and the next week there's another one. And so it can keep pushing us away from getting this IATP that will establish clear medical necessity. When we're doing crisis intervention, we must also make referral to either existing treatment providers. So if I'm doing crisis and crisis intervention, crisis support, how do I get them back to their original counselor or somebody else? Or how do we connect them to services that then might reduce the odds or prevent crisis in the future? Now, for kids, behavioral health crisis can look a little bit different too, that it might actually threaten some safety of family members or the child themselves, or functioning, or also disrupt like their living situation or their family communication, their family, not just family communication, but family functioning. So when kids are at risk of being removed from their school or home, then that could be considered a crisis. The IATP, I know that many are using this particular service, and many are working hard and have lots of great examples of how they're implementing the IATP. This is not to take away from a lot of the great methodology that many people have already used, but instead to give guidance towards how we would recommend that you complete the IATP, as well as using some of the resources that HFS gives for guidance. First, before you ever created IM+CANS in the HFS IM+CANS portal, you want to create a master record. You want to create that before you ever create the IM+CANS document. And so when you're creating, you're adding a client, you're adding the client master record. In doing so, what's going to happen is it's going to pull all of that information into the IM+CANS. If you create the IM+CANS, then you have to go back and create the client master. And what you'll find is that it won't pull information. It'll only pull it whenever it creates it. And so the strategy, the method is create the client master first. Create the client master, complete everything you possibly can. Try not to leave a lot of blanks unless clients specifically don't want to share certain information. They say they don't want to share it. That's okay. But answer the information, and it's all going to pull into the IM+CANS for this particular one. And every 180 days, it's going to pull in that information for you as well. So how does HFS define the IATP? The service definition for this is time spent completing clinical interviews, reviewing documents or records, discussions with parents, guardians, other collaterals like teachers, daycare workers, etc., maybe other providers. So if I'm a therapist doing this, maybe there's a psychiatric provider that's also here that I might be collecting information from that person, reviewing that information to formulate the diagnosis and make service definition recommendations. When we're doing the IATP, it does require that every 180 days, so every 6 months, that is updated. What we recommend, and I'll talk about it a little bit later, is get that updated a little bit before then, maybe about 30 days before. So that way, if there's someone gets sick, I get sick, they get sick, then it doesn't end up pushing us back where we end up with an expired IATP. Also note that an IATP is not activated, is not current until the LPHA has reviewed, approved, and signed that document. So it's not activated. What will end up happening is the LPHA, which is me at this particular point, but we'll also have other LPHAs, they will sign that document on the date that you turn it in. So it's not going to be a delay in that signing. However, do know that it's not based on when your service note is. It's based on when your LPHA signs that. It's not based on your signature. It's based on the LPHA signature. And so we need family members to sign it. An MHP also needs a QMHP, so a mental health professional. Typically, someone with a bachelor's degree also needs someone with a master's degree, a QMHP, qualified mental health professional, to have a face-to-face contact with that client and to then sign off on that. And then from there, the family member, the caregiver, the youth that might be 12 or older, the MHP and the QMHP have all signed this document that will come to the LPHA, who will also sign this document. Make sure that when you're getting signatures, that a copy of the entire IM+CANS goes to the family, and that a copy is attached to the signature page. And that way we can ensure that the family has a copy of that, and that the LPHA is able to review that document all in its entirety. What the LPHA will do then is add a signature to that signature page and to the document and in the IM+CANS portal, which at that point, you now will have an active IATP or active IM+CANS. This is not a completion of a form. So if I'm going in and I'm just completing the form because I know a lot of the information, that's not necessarily, that is not an IATP service. If I'm going in and I'm reviewing records, or I have records from either previous treatment providers or records from hospitalization or other things like that, when I'm reviewing those documents and those records, that could be, that is an IATP service. But just completing the document without a consumer, without family members involved, without direct interaction, that's not an IATP activity. I mentioned this earlier. All right, so how do we document medical necessity for the IATP? So it is required that there's medical necessity that the IATP service is happening, so that the intake service is happening. For the intake service. So we've got to document that. I'm going to get to that here in a minute. But first, let's talk about the entire treatment episode. What does the IATP tell us? Why is it important to do the IM+CANS and all of the different sections of that? Here's what's required for necessity for any treatment that is going to be provided within the center. First, we have to show that there's a behavioral health need, right? We're providing behavioral health services as a behavioral health clinic. And so there has to be at least a 2 or 3 in one of these behavioral emotional need domains. In addition, there has to be a 2 or 3 in a life functioning domain. And so a 2 or 3 is needed to show that there's an impairment in some kind of functioning. And that's part of any diagnosis, is that we have both the symptoms and there's an impairment in our functioning. So that is necessary to be there. And then in addition, we want to make sure that every supporting information narrative section has something in it. I'll talk a little bit about what to do when you don't really have anything to add there. But if you have a 2 or 3, make sure that you have a narrative. That narrative is required for medical necessity to be there. So that IATP is not complete unless there's a narrative that supplements the 2 or 3 scores in life functioning domains and behavioral health need domains and other domains. So if there's a 2 or 3, or if there's a need area, make sure that there is a narrative. It has to be there. We do have to have a diagnosis. There are some exceptions to that, but not very good exceptions. And I'll talk a little bit about what you can do, but typically that means there's no other services that can be provided. And so you do have to get to a diagnosis. These are F diagnoses. All right, so these are full these aren't Z codes. Those are not considered diagnoses or valid diagnoses to justify medical necessity. Within your IM+CANS, you want to make sure you do a mental health assessment summary. Within this summary, you will tie together all of the information in the previous sections to be able to put this together that supports both the needs and the diagnosis that then will lead to the treatment services that you're about to recommend. There's a golden thread from the referral concerns that are there to the needs that are identified to the diagnosis that is created to the services or treatment goals and objectives to the services that are happening. So all of these, there's a golden thread that should connect all of these things together. If I'm ever doing a service that doesn't seem to relate back to a goal or objective, then that's not a service that is reimbursable or billable. If I'm doing a service that has nothing to do with the needs area, then that may not be a service that is reimbursable. If I end up, like as an example, if I end up with a diagnosis around adjustment disorder or trauma, some say it's PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, yet am I adjusting to trauma section or the trauma section, if I don't have anything endorsed, that doesn't quite match, right? That there's no needs in the trauma area, then there wouldn't be a diagnosis that's a trauma or stressor related diagnosis. Within the IM+CANS, we have to identify at least one goal and at least one treatment objective. And I'm going to talk about an efficient way of doing this and doing this so that you can provide both the compliance to the treatment and to the protocols that are required by HFS and quality care for your patients. And then recommendation for the services. What types of services are going to be delivered, what that's going to be in your treatment plan and your treatment plan to determine what those services are. And then lastly, an LPHA with a signature date. One of the primary things that HFS and managed care organizations will be looking for is the matching of those LPHA and signature dates, LPHA signature and the date, that services are not happening before that date is in the record. All right, so within the IM+CANS, this mental health assessment summary, this little blurb that's required, remember that it is required for all. And this is a place that you get to summarize a lot of what was said, a lot of the needs and strengths, and be able to put that here. I have a general recommendation or example for that. So if you're not comfortable what to do, use this exact formula, right? Put the client's name, their age, where they're from, who they live with, who they were referred by, or what were the main areas that they were referred for, a little bit about their history, trauma, childhood adversity. And then this particular statement I really like, blank exhibits symptoms consistent with blank, adjustment disorder with mixed disturbance of emotion and conduct, as evidenced by symptoms presenting themselves after within 3 months after the stressor, including low mood, including worrying often, including tantrums, including defiance, that meet blank, blank, blank criteria. And so those blanks, those things I just listed are like examples for adjustment disorder. These difficulties have impacted the client's functioning at school, evidenced by increased office discipline referrals or suspension or notes home, something that kind of tells us that there is impairment in functioning. Now, when we get to our therapy notes, progress note or service note, we also have to justify medical necessity here for the IATP. And the reason why is that there's no IATP to justify that. So your first notes, until you get to a finalized integrated assessment and treatment plan or IM+CANS, till you get to that, every note before that has to justify why that was medically necessary until the IATP, which will then confirm medical necessity for all the services listed in the treatment plan. Prior to that, we've got to confirm it here. We've got to put it in the note at this particular point. And so we want to establish or identify the need to assess, and that in this, it's how to identify maybe the needs, what services might be necessary, or how to be able to get the clinical services that are needed. Here's an example of what an intake note can look like for someone who's completed the IM+CANS. So as you note here, there's several places that I'm saying see IM+CANS, right? Like I don't need to repeat the biopsychosocial assessment. I don't need to repeat the mental status exam, the presenting problem, because that's already there, and that's being uploaded into the chart, right? So it's going to be in the record. In here, though, I do have to describe the objective content, right? In here, I have a description, and again, use this exact language if needed. Needed to assess client for needs, strengths, medical necessity, and services to be provided, right? So why do we need to do this? Well, we need to assess. Assessment will determine all of these things. And then what did I do? Conduct a clinical interview, review of documents, and review of information to formulate a diagnosis and service interventions. Maybe you don't review documents for all of yours. That's okay. Just say conduct a clinical interview and review of information to formulate. That's fine, right? That's totally fine in there. Here, we're going to put in a plan. Now, many times you may find yourself doing more than one meeting to complete your IATP. If that is the case, then you might say continue IATP service, right? Because this is still the same service, IATP, even though it's happening maybe in more than one event or service. Or maybe it's done, and now we're at the point that we're going to say begin treatment services as recommended. And so now we're moving, that's the plan, is to begin treatment services, because now this is the note that shows we've completed the IM+CANS. Here we're going to add the diagnosis from the IM+CANS. It needs to match that because we want that to show up in all of our service notes that matches, again, think that golden thread. How do we connect all of these things together? And then I'm going to add my mental health summary. So this statement that I just created here, I'm going to take this entire section and I'm going to add that into the mental health summary here. And that's going to show up in a lot of my notes. And it's going to be this constant reminder of what we're working on and why we're working on what we are. Like, why is this tied to functioning? How is it tied to functioning, needs, strengths, etc. Make sure that in your service code that you are picking the appropriate drop down for those service codes too. And your participants, as you can see, client and mother here, make sure that you are selecting client and other, and then it's going to have you write in the other people. IATPs typically for children should include caregivers and others in that process. If I'm including also interview with a psychiatric provider or teacher or something like that, I'm going to add that person as well. So make sure that the participants are being identified in your IATP process and in your progress note here. Now, occasionally, you're going to do an assessment and you're going to figure out that they don't qualify. There's not a medical necessity for services, that all of those things that were there, that wasn't the case. Now, note that means there's not services, right? So like to do that means we can't provide additional services. The only thing we can provide is the IATP, and then we have to close out the chart, or I think it's called like a termination note. We do a termination note at the end of this process. We can use an R code, but again, just note R codes mean like we're done at the IATP. So there's not additional services that we can offer if there's not medical necessity for those. So in some ways, this is a nice option. In other ways, if we're trying to serve or if clients, or if they're seeking out services, this is not a very good option for them because they're not getting their needs met. And if there are needs that are there, we just want to make sure they're showing up in the IM+CANS, and that oftentimes will lead to a diagnosis. A couple general guidelines, I mentioned this before: report writing, form completion. Those are not service activities. So there's not a service note. They're not billable services. While you're completing this, you might find something that says age specific. It might say like 0 to 3 or 3 to 18. When there's age specific, if your client's age does not fit within that range, you can leave that blank. You don't need to answer that. You don't need to do anything with it. Skip that item. There's not a ton of items that we're trying to skip, but those are some that we do need to skip. because it's not appropriate for us to answer those questions if they're outside of that age range. If you ever do click on it, you can't unclick it, just change it where it's like not a need, right? So make sure the answer is not a need out of when you're doing that. As I mentioned before, we want to complete supplementary information in all areas. The occasional blank is okay as long as it is for a certain purpose. So occasionally we can leave something blank if the client chooses not to disclose something, right? And we can say like client refuses to disclose, or we can just leave it blank that it's because they prefer not to share something. We can also leave it blank if it's not applicable, like I talked about, like the age restriction, or in some of these, I'll show you subscales here in a minute. If there's not, if a score doesn't justify a subscale, then I'm going to leave that subscale blank as well. But we're not allowed to leave it blank if we just forgot to ask, or forgot to report it, or didn't know what the answer was. That's not, if it's for us, it's not something we can leave blank. Remember to summarize in the supplement information. Make sure to summarize and give additional details for anything that's a 2 or a 3. If you have a bunch of 2s and 3s, you can summarize it kind of in a more broader sense. Sometimes you're just going to have 1 or 2. You just want to elaborate on what that is. You can use the client did not report a history of or current needs in this category, right? So you could do that. The difference between saying like no current need or not applicable or something like that is that I don't know for sure, like it's not my clinical judgment that this is not applicable, or my clinical judgment that there's no needs, but instead it's the client not reporting information that tells me there's no needs. So you know, if you ever do any legal work, it's nice to be able to say this is representing what they have told me, what they've reported to me, not necessarily my opinion that could be used for or against somebody. So when we're looking at subscales, if I responded positively to an item with a subscale, which typically you're going to see that, like you can see here, like this second one, parental caregiver role, there's an E there, right? That means there's a subscale that I then have to go down to. So if I answered, and in this situation, I answered a 2, then now I have to go down that subscale and I need to answer all of those additional items. But then for like job functioning, where it's a 0, I don't enter in anything in those. I skip the subscale D, I skip that one. Subscale E, I complete that. Subscale F, I skip that one. And so we have to complete them if we do mark that there is a need. And remember, if you don't mark there's a need, there's probably, you know, that's not, treatment would not be medically necessary. So there needs to be needs somewhere if treatment services seem like they are necessary for the family. All right, so then as we move down, what we're going to find is that, you know, you have this summary of all the strengths and the centerpiece strengths, the needs, the outcomes, the history. And in that, you want to identify and you can see it in the bold, it says must choose goal numbers before continuing. So then click on the checkbox and double clicking on the checkbox, or right clicking it, clicking edit. You want to go into this document or into this little box that's going to pop up, and you want to select goal number. Only one goal is required. So depending on what, you know, the needs are of your client, if there's one diagnosis, oftentimes I'm going to do one goal. And so, but you can do other things. Just know that it takes, for every goal, you have to list your service objectives separately and service types separately as well. So one is required, one goal, one objective, and you want to select that. So you might find when you're going through this list that some things are clustering together, and you might have one goal and then you might have a second goal, or like in this scenario that you can see in the screenshot here, that I'm picking the things that really relate to what the client has identified and that we're talking about for goal 1. And then there are things that are still there that are needs, but aren't necessarily things that, and this right here is looking at strengths to build, but aren't necessarily things that we're choosing to focus on right now. So they're important, they're just not the priority according to the client. And so I'm going to select some of those, I'm going to skip some other ones, and it's going to give me a good amount of needs and strengths to be able to achieve or utilize to achieve some change in their life to help them meet those goals and objectives. In general, I use a goal and objective that is more broad-based. And so the goal is to reduce the impact and symptoms of the diagnosis identified, whatever that is. If it's anxiety disorder, if it's adjustment disorder with mixed disturbance of mood and or disturbance of mood, if it's oppositional defiant disorder, whatever that is, I'm going to say reduce the impact and symptoms of oppositional defiant disorder. My objective is to reduce the symptoms of whatever that diagnosis is. And then in therapy notes, I can get to some more specific targets and progress measures. They're going to be called objectives, but they're not really objectives from therapy notes perspective. And so what does that look like by the time I've created a treatment plan? So if I've selected goal 1 for all of these action items, they all cluster together to identify all of these areas are impacted or being influenced by this goal and this objective. My goal is goal 1. My objective is 1.1. So it's instead of like you might see in the Word version, there's like a 1A. And that's not necessarily going to match on to what we can do electronically. So instead it's 1.1. And then in the service type, so there's 1.1. So goal 1, objective 1, service 1. And then goal 1, objective 1, service 2. So you can see that as it maps out. And you have some different service details that are going to show up that you can put MH for mental health services or mental health case management, mental health or mental health case management. This is individual work implemented in the home, community, and office 2 times per month, and the service provider is SATTC. So why don't I put a service provider specific name? Well, a specific name can change, and if there are other people that are working on the same goal as me, so maybe there's a vocational trainer that's trying to help this client. Maybe there's a psychiatric provider trying to help this client. Maybe there's a youth advocate trying to help this client. Then also I'm a therapist trying to help this client. When we look at all of that, if I put different names, every time I put a name, I have to then add a separate line item for the different names that are there. That really we're trying to do this as a team to address the needs of this particular client. When you think about the frequency of services, think about like kind of a ballpark of things that too much, right? Like if I said that I was going to do everything weekly and I only did half of those things weekly, then I'm underutilizing or I'm under serving that client. So typically we're going to try to go towards like a more conservative number of about how much. And when you get to looking at like mental health, case management, mental health, and case management, client-centered consultation, and therapy and counseling and community support, when you start looking at those things, and then even group services on top of that, we start looking at it's like, well, how many of these things would I be doing in any given week? So you're going to get, I typically will go with like estimates per month. So that way, and I can go a little bit over, a little bit under, and that's okay, but I don't want to go significantly under or significantly over in that the service frequency. All right, and this is what it looks like for the goal. So you can see here, it's sort 1, plan part, it's the goal. I have the goal number in there, and then I have the description of the goal. Here's the objective. Objective number. And then here's a service type. So MH, case management, mental health, service mode, service place, 2 times per month. And then I can repeat that throughout. Plan part, now I could be selecting plan part service. I probably should have done that. But the clarity here is 1.1.1. And then remember service place, where will you be providing that service? So if you say you're going to provide the service in the office, and that's the only place, then that means you can't provide the service in a home or in the community or in the school. Any of the community is a broad context. Home and office, right? Those are pretty narrow. Office, also if it's telehealth, then it's office. So those all telehealth services originate in the office first. And so all of those are on site for any telehealth services. But if I'm doing school or anything like that, just remember, include those in your service place as options. There are some standard service codes. You don't have to do this, right? You may identify through your assessment that therapy and counseling is the only thing that you want to provide. Typically, case management services can't be provided alone. There has to be other services with case management. So I might choose case management, but also community support, or client-centered consultation, but also community support. In general, these 4 service types are included in most treatments. And so therapy and counseling, community support, case management, mental health, case management, client-centered consultation. I'll talk a little bit more about what some of these are. We've already talked about some of them, like case management, mental health, but I'll talk about some of the other pieces. There are several in there that we don't do, right? So right now, we don't use any of the psychiatric codes. In that, Skylar's psychiatric services actually are provided through a separate code. So they're not necessarily done through the IM+CANS. They're done through medical services. And so they're not tied to this. Psychosocial rehab or community support teams or assertive community treatment, all of those are specialty services that we don't provide in that. Mental health intensive outpatient is very similar to that. These are intensive services that require certain types of programmatic plans and activities that we don't do. And typically they're trying to prevent inpatient or residential treatment or institutionalization. So with kids, we just don't see that as much, that we're providing that type of service. And then case management, transition, linkage, and aftercare. We may find that that shows up later on, but right now we're not providing that particular service. And then we're not providing services residential. As you see the service mode key, that in that you can do individual, group, family, and individual, group, and family. Just remember that when you're looking at services, like if you look at this one here, and you look down here at the bottom, I have to do a separate line for therapy counseling individual and a separate line for therapy counseling in group. So if I'm doing group or family work, it still may be therapy and counseling, but it's going to be a separate line item for family, group, and individual services. All right, so then I'm going to go, once I've done this in the IM+CANS, then I'm going to the therapy notes treatment plan. Remember that we want the therapy notes treatment plan, you'll get those notifications, you'll need that. It'll tell you need to have it, and that carries over certain elements that helps us to be able to have this golden thread that connects all of our service activities back to our treatment plan goals and objectives, back to the diagnosis, back to the referral concerns or needs and strengths identified early on. So we're going to go in there, we're going to complete the therapy note. Remember that the therapy note is not a service activity unless the client is present. So the therapy note is just a local document that doesn't necessarily require a service note that goes with it. So it's not a service activity in and of itself. If you're doing this without patients or without clients, it definitely isn't a service activity. Since it is more of like a local record that helps really connect our assessment activities to our service activities, what I recommend is that you go into the treatment plan. No matter what date you end up doing this, typically you're doing this independently, whatever date you end up doing this, change it to the date of the IATP. We're going to change it to that date because then, you know, you're going to have the service code that is IATP, like the latest service code. So it may have taken you 2 sessions to be able to get the IATP done. But after your second one, you're going to put the treatment plan date as your second one. That hopefully in your second one, you have all of the signatures there, with the exception of the LPHA, and the LPHA will sign that same day. So it's not going to be a concern in that. And by doing so, you're not going to have a treatment plan. It's not going to be like IATP on the 15th, and then a treatment plan will show up on the 17th. And it's going to be like, is that a service code or an activity separately, or was that just when you got around to it? You want to change that date. You can do it on the 17th, but change it back to the 15th. Change it back to whatever that IATP date was that you finalized the IATP or the IM+CANS. And what this is going to do is this will allow therapy notes to then give you a reminder. Therapy notes reminder is now set to give you a to-do list alert 150 days from the time of your latest treatment plan or your last treatment plan. And so that'll give you about 30 days from the time you see that. Now, it may not be that you see that easily, but that will give you 30 days. Maybe you start to notice it after 4 or 5 days, and then you got another 25 days to be able to get that done. Do not wait to do the IM+CANS until 180 days. At 180 days or 181 days, it expires. Doesn't matter if it's a Sunday or a Saturday or whatever it is. So you want to get this thing done up to 30 days in advance, right? So you don't have to wait to 150 days, or you don't have to wait to 178 days or 180 days. Do it earlier, because once it gets to 180, it's expired, and then we're doing an initial at that particular point. So by changing your date, you're going to be able to know the 180-day point for your treatment, for your review or update of the IATP. Remember, the therapy notes treatment plan is not a service note. So if you found yourself that you did a treatment plan note the second meeting for an IATP, and you did a treatment plan, but you didn't do an IATP service note, make sure you're doing an IATP service note. Treatment plans do not have any services tied to them. They are internal documents that are used for the infrastructure built for your chart. All right, what does that look like for us? And so here's what a treatment plan can look like. We know the diagnosis and the diagnostic information or justification. All of that's going to be pulled in from our intake note that we then pulled from our IM+CANS. So that keeps us, again, kind of connected back to the diagnosis, the referral concerns. For presenting problems, typically I'm going to say see IM+CANS, right? Like, we don't have to recreate all of this, just like the intake note. We can reference back. In the treatment goals here, I'm going to put goal 1 and objective 1.1. So again, goal 1, objective 1. And here's the goals and objectives from that previous description, where I'm just going to type it in: reduce symptoms, impact of anxiety disorder, or replace it with whatever diagnosis that you are giving your client. And then objective 1.1 is reduce symptoms of anxiety. Estimated completion 6 months, which is 180 days, right? So we're trying to map onto that same type of timeline, but you can adjust that timeline based on what your plans are, or what you expect, or what the family wants to be able to accomplish, your client wants to accomplish. Now, although it says objective 1, I'm going to reference now 1.1, which means I'm using objective 1.1 and creating then these little sub objectives, right? Like these objectives within the objectives that are my progress monitoring measures that will help me know that I'm moving forward. And so if you recall, we want progress monitoring measures and we want to be able to add data. So I don't want to say like progressing or maintaining or not addressed. I don't want to use those qualifiers in my service notes. I want to put real numbers, right? So here's an example of what this can look like. Reduction of average SUDs per week from 8 to 4 out of 10. So 8 out of 10, 10 being the most anxiety, 0 being none. How much anxiety or distress are you experiencing? Then they're going to answer that question. Baseline was 4. And then every time I'm going to start with 4. It's going to be my first number. And then the next time I'm going to say, I'm pulling the history. It's going to say 4. I'm going to put a comma and I'm going to get the new answer. And then I'm pulling the history, comma, and new answer. So then I'm going to see a number, comma, number, comma, number, comma for every session that I have with them, that I'm growing this progress monitoring or this data to show progress or not progress. And so again, I'm using 1.1 because I'm still working off of objective 1.1 when I'm talking about average SUDs, or whenever I'm talking about the number of panic attacks. All of these, that's still tied back to objective 1.1. I'm going to put the prescribed frequency of treatment, whatever that is, and then I'm going to sign the document. I mentioned some about the IATP review or reassessment process. Remember that the IATP is not done till the LPHA has signed that document. So if I'm going to do a reassessment or a review, that it's not the date of the service. So I might be at 179 days and I'm like, I got to get this thing done. 179 days, that date is not the date that activates the IATP. It is after the signatures are all acquired, that's what activates the next IATP. Like I said before, start early. Remember, you can review prior records. You can review documentation. So if you get a new client, you need to review that stuff for your IATP to update it. You can do that. If there's other service records, maybe it's an IEP or other documents that are out there, you can review those things. Those are IATP activities. In this, when we're doing this review within the 180 days. So when I'm doing this review and it's 150 days, I get my alert, and the next appointment, let's say now it's 158 days in, I do the IATP review. I want to use that code IATP review update service code. If I go beyond 180 days, at 180 days, 181, that is an expired IATP, right? Which means no other services can be provided except for IATP or some of the things that I listed before at the start of this presentation. So therefore, now I'm doing a new IATP. This is, even though it's 181 days, I want to update all my forms, my consent form, my release information, client registration form, go ahead and have all of that updated. And then now I'm going to do the same thing, right? It doesn't, the IM+CANS, I don't have to recreate all the wheel. I still have a lot of that documentation. I'm just going to update it with the client. But now my service code will be IATP initial. Review and update is within the 180 days. Beyond 180 days is another initial IATP. If, let's say, I do my IATP and a month later, 30 days later, I start to learn more, right? Like we just got certain layers of information. Now I'm getting more information. As I get more, there may be something pertinent that I want to put into the IATP or IM+CANS. When I do that, I can update that. So I can go in, I can update that IM+CANS. This is still part of the initial IATP. So at that particular point, I'm going to bill that, or my service code will be IATP initial, still part of that original one. If I just did a review or reassessment, it's still part of that review. So it's really like an extension of, if a couple things are met, a couple criteria are met. I can't change my goals, my diagnosis, or my service types. If I'm not changing goals, diagnosis, or service types, then I can leave it the way it is. It's okay that 30 days in or 60 days in that I realize something and I want to change the diagnosis or the service types, or I want to change the goals. In that, totally fine. I'm just doing a review or reassessment early. If I'm just changing some content, like maybe I didn't realize that there were siblings that were there that really, I was like, oh, that needs to be in the IM+CANS. I can do that. If I'm not changing goals, service type, or diagnosis, we don't need another LPHA signature or even family signature. We don't need the signature page. We don't need to update the treatment plan. But if I'm changing the diagnosis, the service types, or the goals or objectives, if I'm changing any of those things, go ahead and just put it through the process. You're doing an IATP review or update, get a signature page, even if it's 60 days in, and then update the treatment plan. As you update the treatment plan now, that pushes another 150 days for a 180-day window of time. And that's okay. You don't have to start at whatever your 60-day prior was. You start at whatever day you've updated or reviewed the IATP. There are some other services, as I mentioned earlier, client-centered consultation, et cetera, that we will be providing. These are all activated through the IATP. So again, they can't occur before an LPHA has signed the IATP. But first, there's client-centered consultation case management. This is between two professionals communicating about the client and how to help the client. It could be amongst staff within the agency that are both providers. So there might be a psychiatric provider, and there might be a youth advocate, there might be a therapeutic after-school program facilitator, there might be a clinician or a counselor, and the communication amongst those can all be client-centered consultation or communication with other professionals like educators, teachers, case managers somewhere else, school counselors, etc. Any of that communication between professionals or paid people all falls as client-centered consultation. We do want to note what we are communicating about. Typically, we want to talk about services. We might talk about professional opinion, offering our opinion, or receiving other people's opinions, like primary care provider, nurses, etc. Getting their opinion on what all could be included or what the next steps might be. We might be sharing about progress, or they may be sharing about progress. We might be adjusting our treatment plan, or they may be adjusting their treatment or service plan. And we may be talking about how to connect them with the right services and supports that can be helpful. Community support. Community support is more of like a skills development, whether that's the skill of the individual client or that is a skill of someone in the client's life. Really thinking about an ecological framework that our symptoms, our successes, our needs, our weaknesses, all of those things occur within the context of the situation that we're in. Maybe it's family support, maybe it's friends, marriages, etc. How does that work? And so in this community support, if case management's more like fishing for someone to help them, community support is teaching them the skills or teaching someone to fish. And so sometimes clients can need this and can benefit from this, and sometimes they just need someone to help them and take care of some of that stuff for them. And so you're going to be assessing where your client is and how to best support them given what's happening in their life at that particular time. So within this is facilitating some self-management techniques, identifying and using natural support. So that can be identifying mentors, neighbors, other people that are in the community that could be part of that youth's life. That again, don't think paid person, think natural person. Could be churches, could be other places that we're looking for someone to identify as a support for our client or our client's family that will benefit our client. We might be helping them develop coping skills to help them function more in relationships or just their general, school, work, etc. Help them to be able to cope with those things, help them to recover from their mental health issues. So this can be a very broad type of goal. Therapy and counseling. This one is it's all types of treatment modalities, so it really depends. Most of what we do here is cognitive behavioral therapy, and so any of the treatment techniques that you might use with CBT, or if you have a specific treatment that you're doing, like EMDR or TFCBT, all of those things, anything within that modality, within those practices, all can fall as therapy and counseling. In general, we're doing this to promote positive or pro-social emotional, cognitive, behavioral, psychological change within the customer, our consumer or client. Many times in several of these categories, what we're going to find is our checklist will give us the tools or help us select the intervention that's needed to document the activities that we're doing. The last note, although it's a kind of a heavier note, or slide here, is around what's required in service notes. So many of these things are just naturally there, and I want to talk about some of these. For service name, I want you to check for every session. So go to the, regardless of how it was scheduled. And if you find it scheduled wrong, change the scheduler, right? Change if you have a reoccurring appointment, change that reoccurring appointment to match whatever service code that you want to be able to use. So private insurance versus Medicaid, et cetera, et cetera. The default codes, there are codes that, like, when you schedule an intake, it automatically schedules it as blank. When you schedule a therapy session, it automatically schedules as blank. About half the time, those are wrong, right? So go in there and check those and change those as you see that it needs to be changed. Start and end time, that's easy. Mode of service delivery. In our mode of service delivery, there are a couple of things that you're going to note, that it might say virtual, or video, or phone, or F2F, face-to-face. May also say on-site, off-site. All of these are included in the service name or the location name. So you don't have to do a lot with that. Just make sure when you're selecting your service that you're picking video or virtual. I think it says video now. Video, phone, or face-to-face. You will notice some of the things that you thought were on-site before are now off-site. In general, a behavioral health clinic is one particular location, and then the other locations are all off-site. So our family centers, one in Carbondale, one in El Dorado, our space in Benton, what's part of the community building of housing, all of those things, in every school that we're in, all of those are offsite, and you'll just see that language a little bit more clear. So that way you're not having to select these things, that they are, when you select your location, it'll automatically select some of these details for you. As mentioned before, make sure you're selecting your participant, whether you're selecting client, client and other, or other only. Anytime there's others, you have to list it, and it'll make you list that stuff. Like if I'm doing like client-centered consultation or even community support activities, I might not have the client involved at all, right? Community support, I might be teaching some skills that are going to help a mentor work with this client, and the client may not be there at all. So then I'm going to say other only. Client-centered consultation, I'm going to be talking with a teacher or school counselor. I'm going to put other only, and I'm just going to say school counselor. I'm going to say, I don't need to say the name. I don't need to say Matt Buckman. I don't need to say John Smith. I don't need to say the name, but instead I'm listing the role. So I'm going to say mother, father, teacher, educator, school counselor, etc., mentor. I'm not necessarily going to say their name. That's not needed there. And it's probably not even helpful, because then I'd have to say John Smith, math teacher or something like that. So then I have to explain what it is. So it actually takes longer. So just say the role in that one. Location, I've talked about this before. There's only one on-site location, and that's 1200 Locust Street. And that's where our accredited behavioral health clinic is. Everything else is offsite activities, community-based activities integrated within other places that aren't just clinics. And that, you know, that's where the majority of our services really happen. Description of treatment or interventions. As I mentioned earlier, use the checklist that's there. Use the wording from the service definition. They already give you a definition. They give you preferred language. Use that language. That's what they want to hear. They want to hear that language. If it doesn't match what you're doing, though, that's a concern, right? Like that's maybe it's not the service that's happening. But use the service definition language. Learn those definitions. Use this PowerPoint, but also I'll put a link in the next slide. Go to the provider handbook. Right, like that's the source for all of this. And if that changes and updates, this is now out of date. That is a more important source than any of this. All of this information came from that or the frequently asked questions that were sent to HFS. But use the wording from the service definition. Description of customers' response to treatment and any clinical observation. This is a little bit different. We're oftentimes measuring our between session progress. So like the number of panic attacks in the last week, that's between session progress. This is looking at response to treatment in session or clinical observations. And so this is in session progress. So when we're doing this, we're going to be reporting things in the objective or the subjective content. So there's like subjective, and then there's objective. We're going to be reporting things like reduction of SUDS, or client reported the session was helpful, or client completed 2 applications, or client was able to practice blah, blah, blah. So we're trying to note the response to the treatment, the response to the intervention that was within session. And then our objectives and progress monitoring will get the between session change over time. But this is something that's very important that we're including in our treatment plan or our treatment our session or service notes, is making sure that we are getting the response to treatment for that particular service within the session. Signatures, you already have this, your staff credentials. You'll notice, you know, QMHP or LPHA or MHP or RSA. You'll notice these credentials that are already there in your signature. Those are things that are needed. When you're signing your signature page for the IM+CANS, make sure those credentials are there. So pretty much every time you sign, you want to add QMHP or MHP. The majority of our providers are QMHP. You want to add that to your signature. So put your signature, comma that. Put your name, comma that, because that is your credential that has to go on everything. All right, so this is what's required for every service note. Do make sure that you incorporate this information in every service note that's there. It may be a learning curve for a little while, but make sure when you're thinking service definitions, like when I'm getting up here, this is giving me service definitions, right? This is a service definition that I might say facilitation of illness, self-management techniques, identifying and using natural supports, or development of functional coping skills, or interpersonal coping skills, or community-based coping skills, increasing strengths, increasing or reducing targeted needs, right? Those are all strategies that are coming from that definition. Lastly, and again, I'll send you this PowerPoint as well. Do go to this. This is the primary source, and read up on things, and it will benefit you your entire career to do that. As we end here, I want to say thank you for all of the service that you do provide. Thank you for helping us move from a soft money type of sustainability to more of what we can count on for the rest of our clients' lives, the rest of our careers, if we choose to do that with the center, that these types of services and learning how to do this and practicing doing this will be something that will be sustained for decades and decades to come. It also allows us to be able to diversify and be able to use more of our grant funds for other things that can allow us to expand and grow in some areas such as vocational training and other areas that are not so easily funded through Medicaid services. I appreciate all the work, all the care, all of the support that you provide to your families, your clients, and to your colleagues. Thank you.